Over the course of the last 25 years, Polyvinyl Record Company has grown from an idea in the heads of two excitable music fans into one of the more versatile and artistically driven record labels of its kind, working with a roster of well over 100 artists and consistently pushing independent music in new directions. In commemoration of this landmark birthday, we've put together the Polyvinyl Podcast to chronologically tell the story of how polyvinyl has evolved over the last quarter of a century. I'm your host, Fred Thomas, and I've been a friend of the labels since the early 2000s. Along with Polyvinyl staffers Natalie Davila, Andy DeSantis, and Seth Hubbard, we sat down and talked to just some of the folks who have been part of each of Polyvinyl's various phases, conducting dozens of interviews and piecing together an oral history of the label from first-hand accounts and collective memories. With each episode, we'll get deep into every era, moving from DIY beginnings to where the label is at today, and looking at how Polyvinyl and their family of artists have navigated the ever-changing music industry while holding on to core beliefs of positivity, kindness, and good music for all you good people. For this first episode, we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning, or maybe even a little bit before the beginning. Our story begins in Danville, Illinois, a small city about 40 miles east of the more college-centric Champaign-Urbana area. In the early 90s, teenage couple Matt Lunsford and Darcie Knight were growing up in Danville, going to high school there, and getting more and more excited about the DIY music scene that was taking shape in the Midwest at that time. Here's Darcie and Matt remembering some of the earliest moments of those times that would eventually redirect the course of their lives.
We grew up in Danville, which is not the most happening music scene. It's just like a random town in the middle of Illinois. But there's a supportive network of people they were interested in DIY shows and
the
writing
skateboarding
zines.
crowd was huge.
We had a few friends that were a little bit older in high school, and they were doing shows, and there would be 100, 200 kids at some really random VFW or wherever you could rent, just at a show on a Friday night.
And you saw that and you're like, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, we thought, we could do that, because we thought, they're going to move on. They were older generation. They're going to move on. But we would also help. We'd pick up chairs or help bands load in, help load out. We just really enjoyed it. And so we thought, we'll try it and we'll see if we can do it. And sometimes we didn't make enough money, but we just gave it all to the bands. And then our families were pretty good and supportive. I mean, we had a really good group of friends that helped back it.
How often were you doing shows? Was this a monthly thing or?
There would be a seasonal show or a couple shows, and then it would get super cold and shitty. And then this spring there'd be a few shows. But it wasn't reliable. So whenever it happened, it was always exciting, and everybody would go.
One of the first bands to play the shows that Matt and Darcie were setting up in Danville was Braid. Braid and Polyvinyl were integral parts of each other's development from day one, as Braid's very first live performance was a Polyvinyl-hosted show in Danville in December of 1993. Here's Braid's Bob Nanna walking us through how the band formed and what the scene was like at those early Danville shows.
So I grew up in Chicago, been here my whole life except for the 4 years when I went to school in Champaign-Urbana. When I graduated high school, I had begun a correspondence with a person in Champaign who had punk rock videos and stuff. And, this is pretty much before the internet, clearly. So we were trading, shows and stuff. And that was Roy, who eventually was the drummer of Braid. So when I got to college, I wanted to start a band immediately. I was in a band called Friction. I was playing drums in Friction when I went to Champaign. I didn't want to bring my drums, so I was I'm going to play guitar and figure that out. And Roy luckily played the drums. So literally the first week I was there, I contacted him and we hung out, and I met Todd, who plays bass in Braid, immediately. And we immediately started writing songs. I started school, I guess it would have been in August or September. In December of that year, that's 1993, Braid played our first show in Danville, and the promoter of the show was Matt Lunsford. He was friends with Todd and Roy from hanging out, skateboarding, music and stuff like that. Matt was doing shows at a park like a field house at a park called Garfield Park in Danville. And it was a cool little scene out there. And I came down to Champaign and started a band. And then a lot of the other Chicago bands and suburban Chicago bands would come down and play. We would do these house shows and stuff from like Captain Jazz or Somebody or Gage. These were bands that were pretty big around that time. Just Matt was always wanted to be involved in bringing the bands down there. And so it was like literally the first Braid show was set up by Matt. And we got his zine. I think he was doing it with a few other friends, our friend Rachel, our friend Dan, and I think Darcie as well. He interviewed us for his zine. He'd have pictures of us in the zine. And it was just a cool little scene in, small town, basically Danville, but it was cool.
Was there a considerably different vibe at the
100%.
Okay, so tell me about that a little bit. Like, was it like
when Braid started in Champaign, there was no real scene for us there. The scene there was college rock. The bands from there that were getting big at the time were actually getting signed. Bands like Hum, and there was a band called Mother that became Menthol got signed, and there was a band called like maybe the Poster Children or something. There were all these bands that were part of this major label feeding frenzy, and Champaign was one of the hotbeds of it. At the time, I was starting school there. I was 17. You couldn't get into shows until you were 19 there. There was a club there called the Blind Pig, and luckily they had a big like picture window where you could see the band pretty clearly if you stood outside. So all of our friends and stuff would just sort of hang out outside the Blind Pig when like everyone would come through, Archers of Loaf, Afghan Wigs, and June of 44. So I don't know, like all of these bands would come through. We were able to see them, but we never got to play any of those shows. So we had to build, for lack of a better word, build sort of a house show scene there, something that we were familiar with from Chicago. And so we started to do that, started to put on shows at houses. And that was more the vibe that I gelled with or was more familiar with and felt more comfortable within. That's what Danville was like.
Sure.
Danville already had that vibe because it's a small town, so it had that small town vibe, but such a close-knit community of punk rock kids, skateboard kids, emo kids, or whatever. There's not a lot to do there, maybe, but they're all passionate about music, and we all felt really comfortable going there. The Braid show that we played in December of 1993, I think there's a video of it. We were awful. We were such a bad band. I barely could play the guitar. I could sing. I sang in Friction. We just were pretty sloppy. Our other guitar player, Pete, was just going ape shit during the show. It was just like rocking out on the guitar, going crazy. Like we're about to play our last song, and we noticed his amp wasn't on.
For the
entire show.
Oh, Jesus Christ. It was your first show. And okay.
Well, I mean, me personally, I played a lot of shows, and I think Pete had played a lot of shows too. But it was just so funny. We were playing, and he was going, I remember him just going nuts. And then we just like, Pete's amp isn't even on.
Yeah, making no sound, going completely berserk.
No, but and there is 100% a picture from that show where you can see Matt Lunsford in the front row watching this. So it's just like, it's just bad first impressions to an extent.
It's great. And look at us now.
Exactly.
Along with hosting shows, Matt and Darcie also distributed records from small labels. And in 1994, they put together the first issue of Polyvinyl Press, a self-published fanzine with interviews, articles, and photos celebrating the bands, shows, and general activity of the scene they were growing more and more immersed in.
We really enjoyed meeting all these new bands and talking to the bands, and then zines were getting popular, so we thought, we could do that. My dad was a printer, so he printed the zine for us. And he would sit there like, you can't put the F word in here. I'm not printing if you have cussing in this zine. And I was like, oh my gosh, Dad, that's just what somebody said. It was an effing rad show, And he's like, well, I'm not printing it. You better, we're going to do something else or I'm going to black it out.
Did you actually have to censor the interviews because your dad was, no?
We almost did.
We had 3 other people that helped us with the zine.
Yeah, high school friends.
Yeah, high school friends.
And sometimes we're doing like a zine. Sometimes we're doing like a 7-inch cover. Like we'd just be doing all sorts of random stuff on the Xerox machine at Office Depot.
Right. Well, you had like the honor system for that, as I remember. So it's like,
write down how many copies you made.
And you're like, you write down like, we only made 500 copies.
Yes.
Like we would have a table set up at the shows They would come up and they would buy a zine from us, or they were like, this is so cool, it's from Danville, because like Matt said, Danville is just like, a little town that nobody really knows of, so to have something coming out of Danville, it was pretty cool for everybody.
Yeah. We would just be sitting in the back with our kind of curated selection of records from other like really micro DIY labels and selling those records along with our stuff. And people would just come up and like look through the crate, and then that would be an opportunity to tell them about our fanzine as well.
The first piece of music to bear the Polyvinyl name was a split 7-inch single from Alton, Illinois emo punk band Back of Dave and Lafayette, Indiana pop punkers Walker. The record came out in July of 1995 and was included with copies of Polyvinyl Press No. 3. At this point, however, Polyvinyl was still more a zine than a label.
I was researching the label and everything, and I was like, okay, it's the 25th anniversary of the label. Wait, the first record came out 26 years ago, and there was a zine before that.
Yeah, we wrote the first couple zines. We wanted to write about bands that we liked and wanted to spread the word about. And then we thought, well, an excellent next step would be to like put a 7-inch with the zine, which was like it was like a pretty ordinary thing to do at the time. Like, fans like, oh, there's like a 7-inch with it, or like a flexi, or like something like that.
Yeah, that happened often. It was like kind of like a comp with the zine.
Yep. And I think, in fact, the original plan for the 7-inch was going to be either 4 bands or 2 7-inches. I can't quite remember. But there was going to be like a Braid song and C-clamp song. And those never got finished. And so it ended up becoming like a 2-song 7-inch. And we thought like this could be a really cool opportunity to like do something else with releasing music rather than just writing a fanzine. It's a funny question we get all the time. People are like, well, like, how could you possibly not know exactly when you started the label? Well, it's because Darcie and I didn't write a business plan and go to a bank and say like, we're going to incorporate this business idea today. And then the label started that day. It was just like this very gradual thing that came from this really pure place of us loving music, all of this, the scene and music. Yeah, exactly. And all these artists, and wanting to just be there to be helpful. And then it just kind of gradually turned into a record label that then started to pick up momentum. It just like has felt like this gradual snowball rolling down the hill for 25 years.
That snowball rolling down the hill first started picking up speed in 1996. That year, Polyvinyl would reissue an out-of-print Braid 7-inch and make the transition from zine to label with the release of Direction, a 20-band compilation included with the 5th and final issue of Polyvinyl Press. After some short-lived attempts at going to college, both Matt and Darcie dropped out, got married, and put their complete focus into running the label full-time.
So we both started going to community college because, like, first of all, even back in like the mid-90s, we weren't too sure about racking up a bunch of college debt. We both grew up working middle class. We didn't have college funds. Like, if we were going to go to college, like, we were going to pay for it. And so we both started community college. After a year in, I can remember the end of my first year being in class and thinking about nothing but like records and bands and like kind of interesting things are going to be in the mail when I get home, because we were like always like ordering records like to my parents' house and like trading zines with friends, and like we're like, what's going to be over at the P.O. box, you know, because every zine had like their own P.O. box. I remember thinking about that nonstop and just couldn't even concentrate on school. Like, I wasn't that interested in it. I was taking like pre-engineering, like general education courses, and it was super boring.
Your heart was somewhere completely different.
Yes. Completely that was different. Me too. I just was not. I thought, you know what? I don't want to do this. I don't want to work for somebody. I enjoy when I'm going out to see a show or getting in the van with Braid and us just tooling across to go to a show in Lafayette or in Indianapolis, and then just helping them unload their stuff. And I just thought, I don't want to pay anymore for it, because I was paying for my college. So I don't want to pay anymore to go to college because I don't know if this is what I want to do.
And so it was like after that first year, it was like it all kind of happened in like sequence. It was like we both decided to stop going to school. In like the following fall, like we got married. We moved into this like little 2-bedroom house. Our parents were really supportive. After the initial like, you're going to do what? They were like so supportive. I remember Darcie's parents let us live in this little house. It was like 2-bedroom house, like our bedroom and then the other bedroom, and pretty much the rest of the house was like polyvinyl. Like my parents were really supportive of me leaving school after kind of making sure that was really what I wanted to do. And then we started Polyvinyl with like a $3,000 loan that Darcie got.
From like a bank or like a investment?
Yeah, I started like a little savings thing, but then I did get a job. I worked at the donut shop in Danville. So I had saved up $3,000.
All we had was like rent to pay, and like we lived in Danville. There was like nothing going on. All we did was worked on the label.
Where was the label at? Had you put out the compilation at this point? Or
we had put out the Direction compilation. Braid were our good friends, and we had put out 2 Braid 7-inches at the time. And then I can remember it towards the end of going to community college, the internet was starting to come around, and I remember like emailing on like the old all text like DOS email.
Oh, yeah.
At the community college, like emailing with Kaya from Raina Maria. They used to be in a band called Ezra Pound.
Right.
Kaya and Bill, and Darcie and I had like seen them play a couple times, and then Kaya was talking about this new band, Raina Maria, and we ended up like talking about it and like deciding to put out the first EP. So we had that, and then I think shortly thereafter, like then we decided that we put out the first full length. All those things happened right at the end of 1996 into early 1997.
Raina Maria was formed in the summer of 1995 in Madison, Wisconsin by Caitlin Desmarais, Kaya Fisher, and William Keene. Before beginning the band, all 3 had been part of a booking collective in Madison that hosted shows similar to the ones coming through Danville. Outside of a demo, the band's first song appeared on the Direction comp, and within a few months, Polyvinyl released their self-titled debut EP. Here's the band talking about getting their start at the same time that Polyvinyl was getting off the ground.
But our first contact with Polyvinyl was when Matt got in touch and asked for an Ezra Pound track. Ezra Pound was a band that Kaya and I were in before Raina Maria. And that would have been the summer of 95. But Ezra Pound was done, and Raina Maria had just started. And we were like, hey, yeah, that'd be cool, but Ezra Pound isn't doing anything anymore, but we have this new band called Raina Maria.
And that was that for the Direction compilation?
That's for the Direction compilation, that's correct.
There's contact with Polyvinyl, and eventually, did you end up doing some shows in Champaign through them, or how did the relationship sort of like bloom from that song being on the comp?
So when I met Matt for the first time at a show, I think Kaya, you and William knew him before I did, possibly, because he introduced himself to me and was saying, I'd like to start a label with you guys on it.
I remember playing Champaign, and it was either late 95 or January of 96, and they had us come down, and I can't remember who we played with. Maybe it was the Promise Ring, or maybe it was Braid. It was at a bigger place.
Yeah, it was not a house show. It was like at the university maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, yeah. My actually strongest memory from those early days was Matt. After we did the Direction comp, Matt was like, I want to do a record with you all. I'll do anything you want. Like whatever format you want. If you want to do a 7-inch, if you want to do a full length, if you want to do, and he was really, my memory is that he was really clear and adamant about that. He was like, whatever format you all want to do, like I'm here, I want to do this, I want to do this. You know, he's really enthusiastic that way. And that's how the sort of 6-song EP came about, which was originally conceived as an album, right? But I think a couple songs didn't turn out, or maybe we didn't write enough, or I don't remember, but.
I remember it, and I could be wrong too. I remember it was going to be a double 7-inch, and then we recorded it out of phase.
Yeah,
so they couldn't press it because the needle would jump out of the groove.
Yes, the same issue came up when we did the repress. They were like, "There's no way to put this on vinyl," but I think they did. They did this time somehow.
They figured it out. Yeah,
they figured it out. But there was somehow we had recorded the bass guitar out of phase from everything else, and so they were like, "Yeah," and so it became a CD EP at that point. You're right; it was going to be a double 7-inch.
Wow,
there's an artifact of its era.
Before 1996 was over, Polyvinyl would release the aforementioned Braid 7-inches, Raina Maria EP, and Direction comp, as well as a split 7-inch from Days in December and Sweater Weather, and an EP from the primarily instrumental trio Adavan. The following year, after putting out a few more 7-inches, the label stepped into new territory with the release of their first proper full-length album, Raina Maria's debut LP, Past Worn Searching.
Our EP came out in 96, and then our first full-length album was also Polyvinyl's first full-length album release, which was in 97. That was pretty incredible because I think maybe Polyvinyl was distributed by Southern at that time. And I remember talking on the phone with Matt like every day for a couple weeks. I was managing a record store, and he was like, I think I want to spend like $1,000 to send this to college radio. And I was like, that's so much money. Like, that's crazy. And then it started popping up on like top 10 college radio lists, and we're like, wow, okay. And we'd be out on tour, and we would sell out of stuff, and Matt would have to repress stuff, so we would be on tour, and we wouldn't have records at certain points. But it just, a lot of the time, it was like catching up to where either the band was or where the label was. And then the same thing happened for the next album. It was just like a really steep learning curve at times. Yeah, I mean, there were growing pains, but it was definitely, I think, the most comfortable situation we could have had as a band at that point in our career, for sure.
And in the lead up to the interview, since, you asked like a week ago or something, I have been thinking a lot about Polyvinyl, and it really struck me like, I was doing some mailing this last week. Like, I think I mailed 6 boxes or something in the course of a week for whatever reason. And I got a rash on my hand from the adhesive from the tape. Like, just tearing tape to mail 6 boxes. And I was thinking about all these releases, like hundreds of records like, just the number of releases is hundreds, right? And then how many copies of how many records and how many boxes they've stuffed. And I think I took for granted in some ways the sheer amount of, literally in some cases, backbreaking kind of work that goes into their job, and even that's going on right now. Like, as we speak, someone's down at the warehouse, I mean, we had the New York 1955 7-inches. We came up with this design that they were hand stamped. We had this hand rubber stamper. I think we did the first 1,000 or something, and then we were like, this sucks. This is like really, like, my wrist hurts. I don't like this. And we sent it to them, and like Darcie, boom, boom. They did the next however many until the stamper broke and the plates broke on the record, and they can't make them anymore. And I remember them just being like, it's so much work. And we were like, I know, right? Thank you.
Here's Matt Lunsford.
I definitely do remember when we put out the first Random Rio record, and then we put out the third Braid record, but it was the first one that we put out, which is Frame and Canvas. And those happened like less than a year apart. And it was like in like the end of 1997 and 1998. And it really felt like both of those bands were absolutely entrusting me and Darcie with these records that they worked so hard to make, handing them over to us and trusting us to get them out into the world and make them available and keep them in print and promote them and be partners in them. I do remember that feeling like a milestone, that we had put out these like full length albums. Cause as you said before, it was like compilation, 7-inch, like tape, like EP. And then we had these 2 proper albums that were going out into the world for us to take care of.
I remember people were banging down the doors for those records. Those are like monumental records for lack of a better term, emo at the time. Like, yeah, I'm sure like it went from like, a couple envelopes in the PO box, like, what in the fuck? We got like so much business all of a sudden.
Yeah.
I can see where that might have been a moment where it's like, oh, glad I'm not in college anymore because I can be keeping up.
Yeah. Agreed.
God damn!
In 1998, Polyvinyl released Braid's third full-length album, Frame and Canvas. The album was Braid's most widely visible work up until that point, and would go on to be regarded as a benchmark document of late 90s emo. It was their third album, but first with Polyvinyl, despite the close relationship that the band and the label had established since their respective beginnings. Here's Braid bassist Todd Bell speaking to that.
I don't know. I think a lot of it was just we wanted to do it on our own as much as possible. I remember arguing with record stores in Champaign because they wanted to put a barcode on our record to have it in their inventory to sell. And we were just like, no. It's like that level of...
Control?
Yes.
Yeah.
And, we just wanted to do as much as we could and control it and do it ourselves. And, it's weird that it took us like 2 or 3 years to get our own record label. Like that, I guess it was busyness and trying to figure out how it all worked. But I don't know how we ended up on Polyvinyl. I think it was Matt just like bothering us.
Yeah.
The record. But then again, I think back at those times, and I think if we would have just said, Matt, will you put this out? He would have done it. So I'm not sure why we were so wishy-washy and all over the place. I couldn't give you a direct answer. We were just kind of all over the place and I think also we kind of got ourselves into a lot of handshake agreements with people that we said we'd give them songs for things.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's another full-length Braid album in there that should have been instead of all these comp songs.
Sure.
Because we were just writing like crazy, and we probably had material to do a record that probably could have came between Age of Octane and Frame and Canvas.
Yeah.
There's another record in there, but it ended up being 6 to 10 songs that were probably floating around that came out around that time, or we had given them or promised them to people and they didn't put them out until way later, or they never happened.
Here's Bob Nanna.
Staying independent was sort of a given. Yeah, I mean, the first record we did on Divot, which was a friend's label in Chicago. Our second album we did on a label called Mud from Champaign that was a little more established, but not really our scene. So by the time it came for us to do that third record, Frame and Canvas, Polyvinyl had I think they had already done a Raina Maria record and had gotten to be a more organized machine and like a legit machine and like a legit label. And so that's why we decided to do Frame and Canvas on Polyvinyl. But I do remember it being sort of a weird thing of signing a contract with them as a band member. We never had to do before. And I think Matt Lunsford might have thought it was a little weird too. But I remember us sitting at like a coffee shop or whatever and him having these contracts and us being like, ooh, I don't know.
Was this like a long con with like the zines and the house shows to get us to sign this contract?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I'm really glad we did it.
How involved was Polyvinyl with, how did you see them sort of promoting? How did you see them working with the band? Or was it just like you guys just toured the shit out of it and that's...
I think that helped sell the record, just being so hardworking or just fanatical about getting out on the road all the time and playing shows all the time. I was just recently rereading some journals I did like in 98 or whatever, and there was a little bit of frustration. I think they were having trouble keeping up with our schedule, like getting us the records we needed for the shows. But for the most part, it was pretty smooth. We did 2 European tours in 1998, and so if we ran out of anything, it was just like tears.
Here's Matt Pryor from the Get Up Kids, remembering the immediate impact that Frame and Canvas had when it first came out.
That is such a fantastic and meaningful record to a lot of people, but for me, it was like when we first started touring with Braid, they were working those songs out and they were playing them on the road. Like, I remember that record, it was really kind of like the first time that like I was friends with a band and then they put out a record and I went, whoa. Like it was just like, oh, like I knew you were good and you were my friends, but then it was just kind of really meaningful.
Along with Braid's Frame and Canvas and a series of CD singles, the only other music Polyvinyl released in 1998 was the debut EP from a relatively new band from Urbana called American Football. American Football started in 1997, forming out of the ashes of another band, the One Up Downstairs. It included guitarist Steve Holmes, drummer and trumpet player Steve Lemos, and guitarist-vocalist Mike Kinsella, whose previous band, Cap'n Jazz, had played at one of Matt and Darcie's Danville shows. Here's Mike talking about how he fell into both playing in the band and working with Polyvinyl.
Yeah, so Cap'n Jazz breaks up. You're doing some of the first Joan of Arc stuff. You were in Joan of Arc for first couple records at least, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely more involved. Yeah.
One Up Downstairs is your band while you're in college, before American football.
I should clarify, it was a band I was in. They were a band before I joined them again. Like, it was same with, I mean, technically American football, like Steve and Steve were already playing. The Johnson brothers started the One Up Downstairs, and then Lemos played drums with them.
And you're the singer.
Yeah, and I just sort of like jumped on after, like, I was a fan after seeing them in some house shows and was like, I'll Yelp over this.
Nice. So you kind of just passively came into the relationship with the label.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they were just supporting the local scene, and I just kept joining bands in the local scene.
Was that sort of the vibe? Was it sort of just like kids doing a local label with so much enthusiasm and sort of just like coming to you and corralling you into releasing records?
Oh, yeah. And just as, you know, I don't know, I don't remember the exact timeline, but I was like a huge fan of Ryan and Maria, and then obviously became like good friends with them, and then, you know, to be, you know, Polyvinyl was doing their stuff, and Braid, when I came down to Champaign, like Bob from Braid was like, the first email I ever received in my life was Bob Nanna, like,
oh wow,
hey Mike, welcome to school. You know, like, it was definitely like a scene. I at some point, even I think early on, it seemed like they were sort of the mom and dad of it ish. You know what I mean? Like, because they were a couple, and because they were like productive and doing things, they were actually like getting things done in a way like maybe a lot of people around that scene don't actually do. Like, so
sure.
Yeah, so I think, you know, they were on my radar then, and I remember, you know, meeting them outside of, I was too young to sort of get into, maybe it was Mabel's or can't remember what it was called, sort of downtown Champaign. There's like a tiny little venue, so I would stand outside and you can watch through the windows, and, you know, I remember talking to them, and we were obviously all in the same scene and stuff. So
they were excited about doing the zine, bringing cool bands to their town, and they were stoked.
Yeah, I mean, and so, you know, like, there was other people. This is how like bands back then existed. Like, there had to be somebody in these towns that was just stoked, because nobody made money, and nobody,
right?
You know, they just wanted to give them their 40 friends something to do that weekend.
Here's Matt Lunsford.
Though the American football guys were our friends, like Steve Lemos, the drummer, like been friends with the Braid guys, and even played trumpet on some, you know, Braid songs.
We'd go on tour with Braid, and Steve was there sometimes. And
yep, and we obviously knew Mike from Cap'n Jazz, and so they started American football as they were all in college. And they played a few shows around the DIY Champaign-Urbana scene of that time, and we got to know them and saw a couple of shows. They only ever played a handful of shows in their first incarnation.
Like all local shows, all just in like Champaign and Urbana, maybe Chicago or something like that, or not even?
Yeah, I think they played a couple shows in Chicago. I think they maybe went out and played like one or two shows out on the East Coast at one point, and then that was pretty much it. They made a record. We thought the record was really special, and we weren't sure if the band was going to go on, but we decided we would put the record out anyway.
In September of 1999, Polyvinyl released American football's first self-titled album. The band had toured a little bit on their EP, but by the time the full-length was released, they'd already stopped playing live. Not long afterward, they broke up completely.
It was a CD-only release, like very, very, you know, of the time. Basically, that summer, they turned in the record, basically finished school, and parted ways. And then we put out the record like that following fall.
After the band had broken up?
Yep.
Wow.
We decided to put it out because we just thought it was a great record.
Was there any initial response to the record? Were people buying it? Was it sort of like a slow grower?
There was an initial response because people knew the connection to other bands that were doing well at the time. Like, there was the Cap'n Jazz connection, and even though those bands were gone, like, there was still interest in the record. It had sales and some attention initially, but then there was pretty much nothing left to propel it because they weren't writing more music, they weren't playing shows, and they weren't an active band.
American football's initial run was short-lived, but in the years that followed, their music, and especially their first album, took on a life of its own. Much has already been said about the phenomenon of how a record with almost no promotion, and no band to take the songs into the live arena, was able to reach so many listeners. But something magical in American football's combination of precise musicality and emotionally evocative songwriting connected with people on a personal level.
When did you start seeing sort of like it went from this kind of sleeper side project to like a really important thing?
So it almost had like two eras. It definitely had the word of mouth mythology that followed it around, and people talked about the record and told their friends. And that was the only way it got attention, because internet was super early days. It wasn't, making the rounds on the internet.
Right.
There was no press at all, because there really wasn't a press story behind the band. Like, we barely even had a photo of the band.
Right.
They weren't playing shows, like you said, and they weren't making new music. Everything related to word of mouth and people loving it for the music and the songs and telling other people about it, just very slowly, very organically. Like, that record truly democratized music. It was something that people got excited about just through hearing the songs.
American football came up a lot while conducting these interviews with other Polyvinyl artists, as did the strange and beautiful trajectory that first album took. Here's Matt Pryor.
Because I remember when that American football record came out, and I was just like, oh, it's the guy from Captain Jazz, and nothing happened with it. It's like the Neutral Milk Hotel of our when it came out, and then it became its own thing.
Here's Aloha's Tony Cavallario.
The American football record, that was not the predominant style of music. It might seem that way now, but like that was a weird thing to do.
Here's part of a conversation I had with Pedro the Lion's David Bazan, where we ended up talking about the cultural impact of the first American football album, and how we remembered the songs slowly crystallizing from something that was just a blurry part of the landscape into something more influential and iconic.
Somehow I knew about the American football record, but I never actually heard it until like way later for some reason. It was that thing where like I wasn't buying a lot of records at the time because I didn't have any money, and like I just wasn't in that habit. Like I think I had like 4 or 5 CDs that I just listened to over and over again, but all my buddies had record collections, and so I would hear, that's where I heard most of my music. Somehow the American football record didn't show up, and then when I heard it I was like, oh dude, this is rad.
That's the thing about that record. I feel like your experience was the experience of many people, because that's how I felt about it too. I remember sort of seeing it around, and then fast forward 10 years later and it's like, oh yeah, I've known these songs for like my whole life, and they're in the DNA of everybody, but like I don't remember ever buying the record. I don't remember like where I heard it. It was ingrained.
Well, it's funny because I was very familiar with Mike, and like just very enamored of Mike because I was into Joan of Arc, and I saw Joan of Arc play every time they came to town, and his drumming just really floored me. Like I really like his musicality a lot, and Tim and the whole gang, I just wasn't aware of that side of, there's a prolific bunch of people, obviously, too.
Yeah, with every side of them being a completely different turn too. Like, to go from Joan of Arc, the first Joan of Arc record one year, to like the American football thing. There's some parallels, but absolutely not too. Yeah.
That's very true. My friend Josh Golden, who was in Pedro at the time, like later I went to his house and he had the record, and I was like, did you have this back then? Like I think we listened to Owen and not that.
Right. That's the record that was like hiding in everybody's collection without them knowing about it. I DJ'd for a little while, and every once in a while I would throw on the first song, Never Meant. And without fail, the bar that I would be DJing at would kind of like a hush would fall over, and like everybody had like a personal connection to that song. Like the angry like bartender with like a bunch of tattoos looking all mean would sort of like quietly cry to himself, and like everyone had like a similar but completely personalized response to that song. That
there's something so personal about the connection that you forge with a song, or especially like in headphones, or even just in a car driving with your friends after the show and everybody's quiet, and
Yeah, well, that's another thing to think about, like American football not being a band that was playing. The record was just like a singular thing that you kind of had to experience in those moments after the show or by yourself.
I really relate to that. Learning how to make things translate live once you spent time in like the 4-track space took time, and it makes sense that like over the speakers and especially if the feeling that you're expressing is kind of subtle or quiet or, textured, then you get out into like the classic thing of like you're in your room with an acoustic guitar and you feel all of like the nuances of the sound, and then you get to the club and it's just like this plink, 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 and nothing It just doesn't, and I can see that being the case where they weren't road dogs or whatever with those tunes, like that they exist in this space that it might have destroyed it, you know?
Yeah.
I heard maybe Merlin Mann or somebody talking about Elliott Smith and how that he just didn't like to play live in the same way, you know?
I was thinking the exact same thing. I was going to bring up, I think about like the Elliott Smith bootlegs I've heard where people are just having loud conversations while he's playing some of the best songs ever written. And it's just like, you like fucking heathens. Like, what are you doing? Like, you know, like we didn't have that much more time with this guy and you're talking some nonsense over top of it. So yeah, I could see how that might be something American football could have faced in 1999, 2002.
Yeah. Yeah. Although maybe they would have transfixed the room with that deep and wide kind of sound.
14 years after they originally disbanded, American football would reunite and make 2 more albums with Polyvinyl. But we'll get into that in another episode. For now, I'd like to thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the Polyvinyl podcast. In our next episode, we'll get into how things changed when the label expanded beyond their Midwestern roots and the sound that they'd come to be synonymous with. We'll be talking with members of Mates Estate, of Montreal, Someone Still Loves You, Boris Yeltsin, and many more. Please subscribe to the podcast to keep up to date as we release new episodes, and leave us a review if you can, so that this podcast can reach more people. Also, be sure to follow Polyvinyl Records on socials, and order something from the web store, polyvinylrecords.com. Use promo code PVPodcast to save 10% on your next order. Until next time, stay safe out there, and be kind.